The train exhaled its last breath of steam at the Willow Creek Depot a few minutes past 9 on a cold October morning in 1885, and the children came down off the boxcars in a ragged line, blinking against the Nebraska sun like creatures pulled too suddenly from a burrow. There were 11 of them that day, scrubbed pink by carbolic soap, dressed in donated wool that scratched at the wrists and collar, each one wearing a paper number pinned to their chest like a price tag at a dry goods store. The townsfolk had gathered along the platform before the train had even fully stopped, the way people gather for a parade or a hanging, unsure which one they were about to witness. Samuel Doyle was 7 years old, and he stood at the front of the line because the placing agent, a narrow man named Horace Pruitt, always put the prettiest ones first. Samuel had hair the color of wheat stubble and a gap-toothed smile he handed out freely, the kind of smile that made grown women reach into their pockets before they'd even decided to buy anything. He did not know yet that he was for sale. He only knew that people kept crouching down to look at him, and that crouching down usually meant kindness, so he smiled at all of them. At the far end of the line, past the coughing boys and the twin sisters holding hands so tight that knuckles had gone white, stood a girl named Adeline Voss. She was 14, though the paper on her chest said 12, a lie Pruitt had written in his own hand because 14 was old enough to argue and young enough that nobody would check. Her left hand was drawn up permanently at the wrist, the tendon shortened by a burn she'd taken 3 winters back, pulling her little brother under a collapsed stovepipe. She kept that hand tucked into her sleeve out of habit, not shame. Shame took more energy than she had left to spend. Samuel was her brother. Not by blood. Their mother had died of the fever when Adeline was 11 and Samuel was 4, and a neighbor woman had raised them together for 2 years before she too ran out of ways to feed 2 extra mouths. But blood had never mattered much between them. Adeline had rocked him to sleep more nights than she could count, had taught him his letters with a stick in the dirt behind the tenement, had promised him over and over, in a voice she made sound steadier than she felt, that things would be all right.
"Stand up straight," she whispered to him now, adjusting his collar. "Smile like you mean it. They'll be good to you." "You too," Samuel said. "They'll pick you too, Hattie." She didn't answer that. She had learned in 3 towns and 4 platforms exactly how this went. By mid-morning, Samuel had 4 families vying for him. A rancher's wife knelt down and turned his face gently side to side, checking his teeth the way a person checks a horse before purchase, and Adeline watched her brother endure it with the patient good humor of a child who did not yet understand what was being measured. By noon, he was gone. Claimed by a storekeeper and his wife from 2 counties over, a couple who seemed decent enough, who promised him a dog and a room of his own. He looked back at her once before he climbed into their wagon, his small face suddenly uncertain, and Adeline made herself smile and nod the way her mother used to, the look that meant everything will be fine, even when neither of you believed it. Then the wagon rolled away and the platform emptied out around her the way water drains from a basin, and Adeline Voss stood alone with Pruitt and 2 boys too sickly to interest anyone. "Unclaimed," Pruitt muttered, marking his ledger. "Reckon you'll ride on to the Beatrice Mill with the others. They'll find use for that good hand at least." Adeline said nothing. She had learned that silence didn't invite further conversation, and further conversation from men like Pruitt was rarely worth having. She was watching the dust where the wagon had disappeared when a shadow fell across the platform boards in front of her. The man was tall and sun-worn, dressed plain, with a coat that had clearly been mended more than once by a careful hand. He didn't crouch down to inspect her the way the others had inspected Samuel. He simply stood there, hat in his hands, and looked at her face, not her wrist, not the paper pinned crooked to her collar, her face. "What's your name?" he asked.
"Adeline." "How old are you, Adeline? Truly?" Something about the way he asked, like the truth actually mattered to him, loosened something in her chest. 14, she said. Pruitt's pen paused. "The record says 12. 14, she said again, steadier this time. The man nodded slowly, as if he'd expected exactly that. "I'm Caleb Whitfield. I've got a spread 11 miles west of here. I came today thinking I'd take on a boy to help with the herding, but I find I'm more curious about the girl nobody's bidding on." Pruitt stepped in fast, all oily reassurance. "Mr. Whitfield, this one's bound for the Beatrice textile mill, already arranged. Damaged children fetch a lower placement fee, but the mill still pays by the head, and—" "Do you have a judge's signature on that indenture?" Caleb asked, not raising his voice at all. Pruitt's mouth opened and closed. "That's what I thought," Caleb said. "I'll take her." What followed on that platform was not loud, but it was final. Caleb knew the statute, knew the difference between a placement and an indenture, knew exactly which threats, a telegraph to the marshal, a letter to the Children's Aid Society office in Omaha, would make a man like Pruitt fold. And Pruitt did fold, grumbling about damaged goods and nightmares and a girl who'd never fetch a husband with that wrist and that temper he's sure she had. Caleb only said, "Then she'll fit in fine at my place. I've got a temper of my own these days," and held out his hand to Adeline, not to Pruitt. She looked at that hand a long moment, rope-scarred, sun-browned, steady. She thought of Samuel disappearing down the road in a stranger's wagon. She thought of every door that quietly closed on her for the crime of being burned and inconvenient. Then she put her good hand in his. The ranch, when they reached it as the sky went copper with evening, was smaller than the word spread had suggested, but solid. A plank house, a barn in decent repair, a corral holding 2 horses and a mule who eyed her with mild suspicion. A dog loped out to greet them, tail going, and Adeline flinched before she could stop herself. Caleb noticed, but said nothing about it, which she appreciated more than she could have explained. Inside there was a room off the kitchen, small, facing the sunrise, with a quilt in faded red and gold folded on the bed, and a child's drawing of a horse pinned crookedly to the wall. "That was my daughter Rose's room," Caleb said, standing in the doorway like a man bracing himself. "She was 11. There was a diphtheria outbreak 3 winters back, took her and her mother both within 4 days of each other." He said it plainly, the way a person says something they have said to themselves 10,000 times in the dark. "You can take the drawing down if it troubles you." Adeline looked at the horse. It had a kind, lopsided eye, drawn by a hand still learning. "No," she said, "I'd like to keep it, if that's all right with you." The weeks that followed were not easy ones. Adeline did not know how to milk a cow or bank a stove fire that behaved nothing like a tenement grate. She burned the first 3 suppers so badly the dog wouldn't touch the scraps, and she stood over the ruined pan waiting, without quite realizing she was waiting, for a blow that never landed. Caleb only scraped the pan into the fire and said his late wife had made worse her first year married, and handed her the flour sack again. Try once more. She tried. It got better. But peace, once you've learned to distrust it, has a way of getting tested. Pruitt came back on the 9th day, riding in beside a man in a cheap suit carrying papers stamped with seals meant to look more official than they were. A writ, they called it, recovery of misplaced property. Kidnapping, the suited man said, was not too strong a word for what Caleb Whitfield had done, taking a female child into a bachelor's home with no wife present to see to propriety. Caleb read the papers slowly on his own porch steps, gave nothing away in his face, and handed them back. "These were filed in this county," he said. "She was placed by the Aid Society out of New York. Any indenture needed filing before she ever left that state. It wasn't. And her age is 14, not 12. I have her mother's letter to prove it, the one that was in her pocket when she arrived, the one naming her brother and asking that the 2 never be separated." He let that last part sit in the yard a moment. "You separated them anyway for a fee. I expect a judge would find that interesting." Pruitt's face went the color of curdled milk. He and the lawyer left with considerably less confidence than they'd arrived with, but not before Pruitt looked back at Adeline with a small, private smile that promised he wasn't finished. He wasn't. 4 days later, the sheriff came, with Pruitt trailing behind, and a warrant charging Caleb with moral corruption of a minor, a lie so ugly Adeline felt it land in her stomach like a stone. Caleb did not reach for the rifle leaning by the door. He handed it instead to Adeline and told the sheriff he would ride in and answer the charge himself, so long as the girl and the property were left untouched in the meantime. He went without a fight, which confused the sheriff more than resistance would have, and Adeline stood in the yard holding a gun she didn't know how to fire, understanding for the first time in her life what it felt like to have someone choose to protect her at cost to himself. The hearing was held the following Monday in a courtroom that smelled of varnish and nerves. Half the town came to watch. Pruitt's lawyer spoke of propriety and the dangers of unmarried men taking in female wards. Caleb, representing himself, stood and said he was no lawyer, only a rancher who'd buried a wife and daughter and been walking around ever since, like a man searching a room for something he couldn't name, until he found it standing at the end of a line at the depot, in a girl nobody else wanted to look at twice. He produced the mother's letter. He asked plainly why a 14-year-old had been recorded as 12 and how much the Beatrice Mill paid per healthy head versus damaged. He mentioned, without raising his voice, that a federal marshal in Omaha had already been wired about irregularities in Pruitt's ledger. The judge, a stern, gray-haired woman named Coleman, who did not suffer theatrics, asked Pruitt to produce his original New York placement records. He could not. The writ was dismissed. Pruitt was remanded pending investigation and would, within the year, answer for a great many falsified papers besides Adeline's. "Miss Voss," Judge Coleman said then, "do you choose Mr. Whitfield as your guardian?" Adeline stood. The courtroom's eyes settled on her scarred hand, her plain dress, her steady chin. "I choose him," she said. "Everyone else came looking for something pretty to take home. He came looking for someone to keep." "So ordered," the judge said, and struck her gavel, and that was that. Spring came slow to the ranch that year, the way it does on the plains, and Adeline planted a garden for the first time in her life, discovering she liked the particular patience of seeds, the way something so small could be trusted to become something else, given time and water and someone willing to wait for it. Samuel visited on Sundays, brought by the storekeeper's kind wife, and he and Adeline threw stones into the creek and traded news of dogs and horses and burnt biscuits. He asked her once if she wanted to come live with him instead, since there was room. She told him she already had a home, that a home wasn't a room, it was a person who'd had every reason to pass her by and chose to stop instead. Caleb never asked her to be grateful. He taught her letters from the 6 books on his shelf in the evenings, listened without flinching when she finally told him, one night on the porch, about the stovepipe and Samuel's small weight in her burned arms and the year of nightmares that followed. He told her, in turn, about the diphtheria winter, about Rose's unfinished horse drawings, about how grief doesn't leave a person so much as it learns to walk quietly alongside them. "I used to think home was 4 walls and a roof," Adeline said to him one evening, shelling peas on the step while the fireflies came up out of the grass. "It's not," Caleb said, working a curl of wood off a stick with his knife. Mentioned, without raising his voice, that a federal marshal in Omaha had already been wired about irregularities in Pruitt's ledger. The judge, a stern, gray-haired woman named Coleman, who did not suffer theatrics, asked Pruitt to produce his original New York placement records. He could not. The writ was dismissed. Pruitt was remanded pending investigation and would, within the year, answer for a great many falsified papers besides Adeline's. "Miss Voss," Judge Coleman said then, "do you choose Mr. Whitfield as your guardian?" Adeline stood. The courtroom's eyes settled on her scarred hand, her plain dress, her steady chin. "I choose him," she said. "Everyone else came looking for something pretty to take home. He came looking for someone to keep." "So ordered," the judge said, and struck her gavel, and that was that. Spring came slow to the ranch that year, the way it does on the plains, and Adeline planted a garden for the first time in her life, discovering she liked the particular patience of seeds, the way something so small could be trusted to become something else, given time and water and someone willing to wait for it. Samuel visited on Sundays, brought by the storekeeper's kind wife, and he and Adeline threw stones into the creek and traded news of dogs and horses and burnt biscuits. He asked her once if she wanted to come live with him instead, since there was room. She told him she already had a home, that a home wasn't a room, it was a person who'd had every reason to pass her by and chose to stop instead. Caleb never asked her to be grateful. He taught her letters from the 6 books on his shelf in the evenings, listened without flinching when she finally told him, one night on the porch, about the stovepipe and Samuel's small weight in her burned arms and the year of nightmares that followed. He told her, in turn, about the diphtheria winter, about Rose's unfinished horse drawings, about how grief doesn't leave a person so much as it learns to walk quietly alongside them. "I used to think home was 4 walls and a roof," Adeline said to him one evening, shelling peas on the step while the fireflies came up out of the grass. "It's not," Caleb said, working a curl of wood off a stick with his knife.
"No," she agreed. "It's the place where somebody looks at the worst thing that ever happened to you and says, 'That one. I'll take that one.'" By autumn, Adeline Voss had become, on paper and otherwise, Adeline Whitfield. She wrote to the Aid Society office that year about Pruitt, about the falsified ages, about children still standing on platforms believing that unchosen and unworthy were the same word. She was 15 by then, unafraid to be looked at, no longer hiding her hand in her sleeve. The scar was simply the mark of a fire she had carried a small boy out of, proof of what she'd survived, not what disqualified her. The house still faced east. The morning light still came in gold across a bed that had once been a dead girl's and was now, gently, hers too. And on the nights the wind came hard across the plains, Caleb would hear her walking the house the way he once had, and he'd sit up with her by the stove without a word needing to be said. 2 people who had both stood in ashes once, keeping each other in company in the dark until it passed. What this story leaves behind beyond the tears is a simple truth worth carrying. Worth is never decided by how easily a person can be loved, but by whether someone is willing to look past the scars and choose them anyway. Real family is not always the one given by blood, but the one built by choice, patience, and unconditional acceptance, and that choosing someone who has been overlooked can heal both the giver and the given.